If you've ever tried tracing your family history, and millions of us have, you may well have come into contact with your country's census records. In 2002 in the UK, when census records from 100 years before became available online, there were so many people rushing to access them that the website couldn't cope. It's proof of an enduring fascination with the census, the system of counting and classifying every single person in a given nation, which in some countries has been running for hundreds of years. And the census isn't just useful if you're researching your family tree, it's also a vital tool for governments, helping them work out how best to allocate funds for public services, or even in some places how to determine political representation. So when did the idea of compiling a census first begin? How has it evolved over the centuries? And now that we share information about ourselves in so many different ways, does counting populations in a census still serve a purpose? Welcome to The Forum from the BBC World Service. I'm Bridget Kendall and I'm joined by three experts, all in the United States, who will be discussing the stories behind the numbers. In Williamsburg is Catherine Levitan, Associate Professor of History at William & Mary, a university in Virginia. She's the author of A Cultural History of the British Census, Envisioning the Multitude in the 19th Century. In New York is the economist and data scientist Andrew Whitby, whose book, The Sum of the People, How the Census Has Shaped Nations from the Ancient World to the Modern Age, was published in 2020. And in Philadelphia is the social scientist Tukufu Zuberi, the Lazary Family Professor of Race Relations at the University of Pennsylvania and head of the African Census Analysis Project. He's working on a book called The Demography of Race. Welcome to all three of you. And I'm going to be honest with you, talking about something so focused on numbers and statistics has the potential to be a bit dry. So if there's one thing in particular about the census that excites you and you think would excite other people, what is it? Andrew, you first.
Well, I think for me, what really draws me to the idea of the census is that it's this institution where the government of a place reaches out and touches everybody they govern. Perhaps not physically, especially in a COVID year, but in some way everybody is drawn in. And there's not many institutions like that. In some countries, voting has that kind of characteristic, but not everyone votes. And maybe tax is like that, but it's much less easy to love taxation. So for me, the census is fascinating because of that characteristic.
Tukufu, what about you?
I think that we live in a world in which it has been essential to think of the people in terms of populations. We start getting this picture of people who need to count themselves and the people they determine are others. So census making has been essential in the mythologies of national narratives, which we tell ourselves testify the states we live in.
Thank you. Catherine, what about you?
Basically, it's a way for people to envision their own relationship to other people, their own relationship to the rest of their society. And that was really new when censuses began. Before that, there were other ways that people imagined their societies, but it wasn't really through numbers. So censuses changed the way in which people started to understand and envision their own societies.
Now, at the moment, many countries around the world are currently in a census round recommended by the United Nations to encourage governments to hold their census as close as possible to years ending in zero so that the results can be compared. It's a process familiar to many today, and there's evidence too that censuses go back many thousands of years. So, Andrew, can you talk us through some of those earliest examples?
Yeah, so the idea of counting people in a society, it probably predates any sort of written history that we have, right? It probably arose in some way in every society where people gathered in their thousands or tens of thousands. So there's an example in China about 4,000 years ago of the Emperor Yu who tamed the Yellow River, and he is supposed to have taken a census of the Chinese people then. There are censuses in the Old Testament of the Bible, so in Exodus and Numbers. And these are not historical accounts, but I think they give us an idea that even when those mythologies, those stories were written down, people assumed that the census was a kind of ancient institution already. But certainly by the first millennium BCE, we know that there are Egyptian censuses and Greek censuses and Roman censuses, which take the form of counting people in some manner.
And the word census comes from ancient Rome, right?
Yeah, that's right. Census comes from a Latin term censere, which in this context means to kind of assess or to reckon. And that reflects the Roman institution that they called the census, which was very much an assessment of its citizens' lives.
Tukufu, how much do we know about early censuses in Africa?
Many of the most preserved records we have of very early censuses can be found in Egypt. And, they would do a census where you would basically collect the information of how many cows people had, how much land they had, the number of children they had. So we can find those in hieroglyphs and some of the pyramids, but also in papaya. Where people have taken those records. Some of the earliest life tables that we calculated, which require an accounting of the population, have been tabulated for Egyptian populations because it's some of the earliest data that we can use to speak of relatively large populations. When the place is small enough, you can be very haphazard about that. But when it grows and, you start talking about tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people, the governmental need, the administrative need for a census only grows with the administrative needs of the society. And so those societies which grew very large, say among the Hausa, for example, or you find in that group through various kingdoms that they've taken censuses.
Catherine, elsewhere, what was the original reason for counting people in early censuses? What were the governments hoping to achieve by this?
I think there were probably two most common reasons. One was in order to figure out who could fight in wars, so basically military conscription. And in order to find out who could fight in wars, ancient governments like the Roman Empire had to find out how many men of a certain age there were. And I would say that the other thing that censuses were most commonly used for was for purposes of taxation. And that kind of speaks to some of the things we've just been hearing about, where in some cases governments were counting not only people but goods. They were trying to figure out how much of different things people had in order to kind of figure out where the wealth was in the society and figure out who could be taxed and how much. So taxation was another reason to know how many people there were and where they were.
So let's fast forward and look at how methods of carrying out a census began to change. By the 18th and 19th century, census taking was becoming more systematic, and more countries were doing it. Andrew, what kind of questions were being asked in these early modern censuses?
It's an interesting question. Today, for instance, the questions that appear on a census are something which is kind of constructed by statisticians and well thought out and based on decades of experience. But that wasn't the case in that kind of early modern period. Censuses were very often taken for quite specific purposes or under quite specific circumstances. So, for instance, there's a census of Iceland in 1703 that was taken by the Danish king, whose possession Iceland was, because Iceland had been facing a famine and had kind of requested help. And so there they collected the location of each person, their name, their age, and their occupation. And really just by coincidence of the fact that Icelandic names have a kind of gender signifier in them, we also then know the gender of all those people. That's 50,000 people of an entire modern country collected in a census. It's a lot more comprehensive than many censuses that were taken at the time. But it's kind of representative of the small number of questions. So a similar early census in the kind of European mold, the 1790 census of the US, the first census of that new nation, it asked a much smaller set of questions, in fact. So that was a kind of house-by-house process. But the only name recorded at each house was the name of the householder, who would be the senior male in the house. And then in addition to that, there were just 5 numbers recorded. So there was the number of free white males over the age of 16, the number of free white males under the age of 16, the number of free white females, the number of other free persons, and then the number of enslaved people. And you can kind of already see by the level of detail collected on each of those groups, how they were considered in importance in terms of that data collection exercise. So the fact that males were broken down by age and females weren't, the fact that white people were broken down by gender, but people who were non-white were not, gives you an indication of the fact that, this was not a neutral exercise.
So not a neutral exercise, very selective, but also it makes the point that in comparison to antiquity, this wasn't just about counting the population, but it was collecting more personal information.
It definitely began to, yeah. I mean, those censuses, again, they were not guided by a kind of a statistical scientific outlook, right? Statistics as a discipline didn't really begin to coalesce under that name until, say, the 1830s. So before that, those first US censuses, they were collected for a very specific administrative purpose, which was the idea of kind of representative government, which of course didn't require actually counting everybody because some people were counted more for that purpose and some people counted less.
Tukufu?
I said some of the people were not counted because they were not counted as human beings. The essential point here that is missed in those early censuses is that the enslaved were considered 2/3 of a person. And they were considered that way because of those who had the power wanted to emphasize their lack of humanity.
And Catherine, what about what was going on in the UK in the early 19th century?
Yeah, so I think as we've been hearing, censuses were taken in very different ways in different places. And in fact, the British Empire is a great way to look at that, to look at the vast variety of ways in which people took censuses in their different colonies. But in terms of Great Britain itself in the early 19th century, the first census was taken in 1801, and it actually wasn't until 1841 that any names were gathered. So those first censuses, 1801 through 1831, the government wanted to know how many people lived in each community, in each village, in each parish, in each town. But they didn't really care what their names were. And what they were interested in was in basically questions about sort of how the local economy worked, how many men and women there were, again, because they were worried about military, at least the possibility for military conscription. It started during the Napoleonic Wars. And they were worried about how to feed the population. So those early censuses involved an enumerator who was often a local overseer of the poor or something like that, someone who already played a local administrative role, going around and counting how many houses there were in the community, how many men and women lived in each one of those houses. They started to gather some basic information about age, and they gathered some basic information about occupation, but not the occupations of individuals, more the occupations of families. They wanted to know how many families worked in agriculture versus how many families worked in industry. So what's kind of interesting about this is that in these very early censuses, in a small community where the overseer of the poor, the person acting as the enumerator, already knew everyone in the community, they may not have gone door to door at all. Instead, they might have just filled out the form that the government sent them that asked how many houses are there in your community and how many people live in these houses. What that means is that individuals living in Britain in 1801 may have been completely unaware that a census was being carried out. If the enumerator already knew how many people lived in the house, they wouldn't have bothered going and knocking on the door. It wasn't until 1841 that there was actually a census form being brought around to every house and being filled out by every family, which really changes the way that people kind of understand their own interaction with this process and their own interaction with the government.
Andrew, you mentioned the first census in the United States. This was one of the first to link population numbers collected by the census to political representation, and that's something we still see today in the US, as well as in other countries, including Australia and Nigeria and Kenya. So how is that designed to work for political representation?
You have to remember the Revolutionary War was fought over this sort of perceived injustice of taxation without representation. And so when the framers of the US Constitution got down and started to think about what kind of government they would want, they were tying those two things together. So their original idea was that each of the states of the United States populations would guide both their representation in the Congress and also their contributions to direct taxation. Well, the kind of taxation that they had in mind, this direct taxation, didn't really get used very much as the country progressed. But this idea of using population numbers from the census for representation, it really took off. And I think the reason for that is it gives a kind of illusion of mathematical precision to how you might distribute power within a society. And I think, of course, we're all aware today that there's lots of ways in which that fails. But it's definitely an improvement compared with the sorts of systems in Europe that they were looking towards. At the time that the United States was doing this, the Parliament in England still suffered from this idea of kind of rotten boroughs where you might have a representative in Westminster who was really only representing a handful of people who kind of elected that person. So very unrepresentative. But of course, the United States system of government, for all its kind of idealism, was really a deeply flawed implementation of that idea.
So, Tukufu, I know that you've already talked about this, but just make it clear for us, who were the people who weren't counted at all or who were not properly counted?
Censuses serve a really important function in society. It is a space in which people are defined And it is a space in which those definitions have political consequences. And they're prescribed in the process of collecting the data and summarizing the data. And so this process of collecting and summarizing the data in the United States was essentially part of the articulation of a society in which white supremacy was going to determine who was human and who was not. The United States is famously known for discounting the value of each of the individuals who was enslaved and not counting them as a full person. And in fact, its requirements for how to count the indigenous population here was done in this way. They are the civilized and the uncivilized. So the civilized get counted one way and the uncivilized get counted another way. So it is for this administrative purpose of determining people's status in society that this information was collected. So people can act as if they were interested in knowing about the entire society, and that's kind of a neutral thing, but it wasn't. In reality, what they were doing is determining who was a person and who had rights. Because when you have a society which is full of enslaved individuals, whether it's Rome or the United States or Britain, especially with its colonial attachments, then you begin to get a more complete story. A story which doesn't ignore the history of a large amount of humanity who were in fact sacrificed to create the plateau financially so that these kinds of statistics would make sense to collect.
So one can see that the way the census was set up could benefit some people and not others. Catherine, we were talking earlier about why societies decided to count their populations. And you've touched on this a little bit, but can you tell us a bit more about the shift in motivation that there was at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century in the US and other countries, the whole reason for undertaking a census in the first place?
In one sense, it really all came out of Enlightenment ideas about classification and good government. So these were sort of new political theories about how important it was for governments to understand their population. So these 18th century ideas about government really focused on population as a kind of representation of power. And a country that had a large population could see themselves as more powerful on the global stage. One thing that happened in the 1830s is that as the statistical movement took off, as statistics became a kind of more prominent discipline, it also started to be clear that the government's initial reasons for taking the census might have been kind of getting out of their hands in Britain. And the people who wanted to expand the census and who wanted to use that census for new purposes didn't in fact always agree with the government anyway. So the census, while it began as a tool of the government, kind of came to be appropriated by other people to use for their own purposes, both for good and bad purposes, I guess you could say.
And the government also would have to face up to uncomfortable facts, wouldn't it, on the economic front, because the data that they would collect was not just who was in work, but those who are not working, which linked to the idea that was current at the time of the surplus. Can you tell us about that?
Surplus is an idea that kind of came out of, or at least became prominent through the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who had this idea that the population increases faster than the food supply, and therefore there will always be overpopulation that has to be dealt with somehow. Now, Malthus was writing in the 1790s, but became more and more influential. So by the 1810s and 1820s, he had really influenced the way that economists and even the general public thought about the economy, and really about the whole idea of scarcity, the idea that there wasn't really enough to go around, and that therefore in some cases or in some places there were too many people. So census takers got very interested in this question of who was surplus and who was not.
And it's right too, isn't it, that the census of 1851 in Britain asked for the first time about marital status and threw out the fact that there were lots of unmarried women of a certain age.
Yes, and so that's one of the most interesting examples of this kind of conversation about surplus. The 1851 census, as you say, asked about marital status. So for the first time, it asked not only for who the head of the household was, but what everyone else's relationship was to the head of the household. And what they found was that there were large numbers of single women in Britain. Many of those women might have been supported by fathers or by brothers, and many people saw those single women as a surplus population because there were more women than men. But what they were really worried about was unmarried women because of the expectation that women would marry and bear children. And some people came up with very interesting proposals to deal with this, including shipping all of those unmarried women off to the colonies. While other people, including the early feminists in the 1850s and 1860s, suggested that instead of shipping the women off to the colonies, it might be better to open up educational and professional opportunities for those women. And so the 1851 census actually did help spark the feminist movement in Britain in the 1850s.
That's absolutely fascinating because it shows how important the questions on a census are and how they're formulated. Andrew, what's your view on this?
The questions on a census reflect the people who design the census, obviously. Statistics and the kind of social sciences grew out of this kind of Enlightenment ideas that Catherine was talking about, that everything could be described by sort of number and weight and measure. And that makes a lot of sense if you're doing chemistry or physics or perhaps even biology, but it makes a lot less sense when you apply it to human populations. Nonetheless, that was the task of census takers, to try and come up with the categories that they could use to divide up populations. And that meant both domestic populations, but also, as we've discussed earlier, sort of colonial populations as well, where you might start to think about, well, what are the kind of racial or ethnic dimensions that you might, for colonial reasons, decide to divide a population into. So, I mean, this goes on today, right? Even in this current census round in England and Wales, I know that there have been controversies about the questions around sex and gender identity, which have kind of become a particularly interesting issue this year. For a long time, it was the case that census takers could assume that a question about sex would be answered male or female, and there wouldn't be a lot of disagreement in the population. But we're now realizing that those concepts don't map neatly to people's actual identities. It's happened elsewhere as well. So India actually introduced a third gender option on its 2011 census 10 years ago. And the US census last year, it wasn't so much the kind of binary sex question which attracted attention, but a question that didn't appear on the census in the end, which was one about citizenship. So the US Census had on and off asked people about their citizenship or concepts equivalent to citizenship, but it hadn't done so for quite a while on a census. But the Trump administration proposed to add a question to the census that would ask each person, is this person a citizen of the United States? And that's a question which would be, I would say, fairly routine in my home country of Australia. But it's a very controversial question in the specific circumstances of the United States, because there's a large undocumented population, maybe 11 million people here, for whom asking if you're a citizen is kind of a threat, right? There's a threat of deportation sitting in that question. So questions become very dependent on local conditions and how people see their own identities and the political consequences of that.
So far, we've been discussing how the census became an indispensable part of a modern government's toolkit as more and more countries undertook censuses in the 19th century, and we've touched on some of the problems of the methodology. But the census also ushered in a whole new relationship between the individual and the government, right, Catherine?
Yes, increasingly, the census was a moment, even if it was only every 10 years, when every individual household would actually interact with the government directly. So in that way, it was very much a moment of intrusion, a moment where the government actually comes literally into your household, into your house, in order to acquire information. But what's interesting about the census is that while it began as a tool of the government, it very quickly came to be appropriated by all kinds of other non-governmental actors who realized that they could use it to their advantage. So in some sense, it kind of got out of the government's hands once it was out there. And that's why I think there's always a really big kind of tension in the 19th century especially, and perhaps today as well, between the census as something that the government can use to control people, to exclude people, to marginalize people, and the census as something that people embrace because they realize that by being counted, they can actually demand different things that will actually help them. They can demand rights, they can demand resources, they can demand privileges if they are being counted.
What's your view, Andrew?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Catherine's understanding of that. Another thing that I I do actually find fascinating about that relationship between the state and the individual is how the census eventually led to a change in that relationship quite outside the boundaries of the census itself. So the census was actually pivotal in creating some of the technologies of kind of control or of knowing the citizen that exists today. So most famously, the 1890 census of the United States was the first in which some kind of electromechanical process was used to count people. So instead of just armies of clerks kind of reading off census schedules and kind of tabulating these things by hand, for the first time, an individual census record would be punched onto a card so that there were kind of holes in this card representing different characteristics of the person. And then those cards could be fed through a machine. And very, very quickly, you could kind of tabulate numbers of people. Well, that technology is the kind of forerunner of really all of information technology and of the modern database, which is the way that governments now interact with their citizens.
So, Tukufu, we talked about the colonial experience, but more generally, how do you see this trajectory of how censuses have shaped the relationship between the individual and the state?
There's always the question of who is counted. But as important as who is counted are those people who are uncounted, and those people who are miscounted, and those people who are undercounted. And the reason I think that all four of these spaces are very important is because they get to the fact that there is a lot of error in the collection of these data. So whether they are counted as a full person or whether they are counted as a less than full person, whether they are marked as living in a particular neighborhood and therefore that neighborhood having certain treatment by the government, all of these things are bound up with the process of census taking. And so in a way, the census has always kind of served this political purpose. And sometimes people get very agitated by that and they can be impacted by the politics of it. In Nigeria, you get a substantial amount of conflict around taking a census, so much so that taking a census and making the data publicly available can actually lead to a president falling and being ousted from office. But it can definitely lead to much political strife in areas that feel that they were undercounted and therefore are being under politically represented as a process or as a consequence of that counting.
As the census evolved, the information it provided about people could, in principle, be put to good use. Today, for example, in the United States, the data from the census is used to decide how and where to allocate more than $1 trillion worth of federal grants. But some would argue there's always a trade-off when an individual is required to provide potentially sensitive information to those in power, and trust in those who hold that information can sometimes be misplaced, especially when the census is used for more sinister ends.
Another sign that bodes ill. Today, notices inform the Jewish population of Warsaw that next Saturday there will be a census of Jewish inhabitants. Our hearts tell us of evil. Some catastrophe for the Jews of Warsaw lies in this census. Otherwise, there would be no need.
An extract from the diary of Chaim Kaplan, written in 1939, shortly after the Nazis occupied Poland. Andrew, briefly tell us what happened.
So in September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and Warsaw fell to the German army by the end of that month. And as the city came under German control, they created a Jewish council, which was a kind of body appointed to kind of control and administer Jewish life in the city while under German occupation. And the head of that council was a man named Adam Chernyakov. You know, from his first meeting with the German occupiers, they asked him to take a census of the Jews of the city of Warsaw. The ideology of the Nazi Party was known to them. This was not the kind of census that was going to be used to provide opportunity or to provide services to the people. Well, sure enough, over the next few weeks, we see these kind of diary entries of the census taking place, of forms being prepared and counts being done and things being summarized. And at the end of it, 360,000 people were counted. But it turns out that those premonitions that people had about the census were quite accurate, because over the next few years, many people died in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then less than 3 years after the census, those that were remaining were transported to Treblinka.
That's a particularly shocking example of the misuse of census records. But, Andrew, it wasn't something unique to the Nazis, was it, in the Second World War or later?
Yeah, unfortunately not. So the most kind of prominent contrasting example from the Second World War period relates to the internment of Japanese Americans. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Japan and America are at war, there was a policy within the United States of rounding up Japanese Americans on the West Coast and moving them inland where they were thought to be less of a risk to security. For many decades, there was a kind of debate, at least within the circles of historians and the Census Bureau itself, as to whether individual census records had been used to aid with that rounding up. But just over a decade ago, a couple of historians in the United States finally found evidence in the archives that, in fact, this had happened, that the Census Bureau had provided specific records of Japanese Americans actually living in the Washington area in relation to a supposed threat on the life of the president. So it was this kind of smoking gun that census data, which had been collected in 1940 with the promise that it wouldn't be used on an individual basis, had in fact been used in that way. And you're right, this is not the only example where that kind of thing has happened. And as recently as after 9/11, there was a case not as egregious as that, but where the Department of Homeland Security had requested special tabulations of Arab Americans on a kind of aggregated by zip code basis to try and assist with their sort of investigations. And so there, it's not individual data which is being released, but still I think there was a lot of controversy as to whether that was an appropriate use of this data that was collected for very different reasons. Today, there are in many countries very strong legal protections and very strong ethical codes which govern how census data can be used. But of course, as that kind of Second World War period shows us, it's very easy and very quick for laws to change in these situations of war or other kind of existential threats. So at the end of the day, as soon as data is collected, there is always a risk that it will be used in some way that was not foreseen.
Catherine, in your historical research, what sort of skepticism about the census have you come across? Who's been opposed to the idea of a census and why?
Yeah, there's always been interesting opposition to the census. There were people who were suspicious of the census because the census seemed like a democratizing process, and not everyone was into democracy. People who were used to holding their power through traditional interests rather than population. So, for example, 18th century landowners were very opposed to the idea that everyone counts equally. They thought that their status should come from their traditional power and their wealth and their status rather than from their numbers. And then there were people who were opposed to the census because they thought it asked overly intrusive questions, such as about religion. There were other people who simply thought that the census didn't do a good job of capturing the realities of human lives, that statistics itself was not a good method. So Charles Dickens, for example, wrote an interesting article about how the homeless were not successfully counted by the census. And counting homeless populations has been a big challenge for census takers. It continues to be a big challenge. That's one of those marginalized groups that does not really very accurately get counted. But Charles Dickens and lots of other 19th century authors made the point that maybe the best way to find out about people, marginalized people like that, is not through counting at all, but rather through individual stories rather than through aggregated numbers.
As we've been hearing then, the census has raised many issues throughout its history, issues that haven't gone away, about confidentiality, data protection, and the role of the state. But what has changed is the technology used, and some methods have been particularly helpful when it comes to collecting census data in communities torn apart by war. Here's Sabrina Uran from the United Nations Population Fund.
Collecting census in peacetime is already a huge undertaking. But conducting a census in a humanitarian crisis or right after a country suffered from a humanitarian crisis is a completely different story. Not having the information on where populations live in relation, for example, to 2-hour access to surgical care has serious implications on life and death, which is why we started thinking about alternative methods in times of conflict or for areas where no data will be collected. Some traditional methods are still involved when you think about the modeling exercise because we still rely on ground truth statistical information. But we need some kind of input data to then base our estimates, our projections on that information that we actually do get from the field. And so in Afghanistan, we applied the approach for the very first time with our partners from the UK. And the last census in Afghanistan was conducted in 1979. So 2016, the data was utterly outdated. So what we did then is we had the information from the provincial census, from those some provinces where the data was collected on everybody in the household, the number, the characteristics, sex and age, all of that traditional information we get from a census. In addition, we got access to high-resolution recent satellite imagery with its geospatial auxiliary data. So all of a sudden then, nighttime lights or slope or vegetation index or settlement density or the distance from a road or the distance to the next settlements become important indicators for us to understand and predict how many people there are. And we create the relationship between the spatial information and the observed information. Obviously, it doesn't substitute a census because what we get from modeling is a rough estimate, but it still gives us something in the absence of information.
Sabrina Uran from the United Nations Population Fund. Some countries have dispensed with the massive expense and effort of a census altogether. After all, the information we're asked to provide on census forms is by and large information that can be pulled together from other sources. And these days it's often the same data that many of us share with private companies and social networks. So what does the future hold for the census? Catherine?
While it's true that it's much easier now to find out about people without waiting around 10 years for the census, it all depends on what's required. So some countries don't have very much required information. They might have lots of information floating around, but it's not information that everyone is required to give to the government. And so the census still serves a purpose in terms of counting everyone at once, asking the same questions. And I think it's hard to imagine governments giving up on that until they have other ways of actually collecting equivalent information for every single person in the society.
Chukufu.
Our ability to know things about each other are much more pervasive than they have ever been. The ability to even tell the secrets of governments, and no matter how hard they try to keep those secrets, has become much more simpler because of these flows of information. I do not think that's going away. The thing that we have to pay attention to is how do we get our moral and ethics together so that we care more about human beings and our survival on the planet. Because the way we're doing it now, it is being co-opted to only kind of pay attention to the needs of markets and things of this nature. But this large body of information that is not being collected by governments needs to be used for the advancement of the human population. How do you do that? I'm not sure, but I do not think we're going to reduce the amount of information that people make available. So social media has become a collector of data by virtue of the structure of the platform. And that is a wonderful opportunity if you think about all the positive things we could do. But at the same time, it is frightening when you think of the history of what we have done by using these data.
Andrew?
In a certain way, the really traditional census, the kind of romantic census I referred to at the beginning, the census of knocking on doors, that census has already mostly disappeared in rich countries. Very few people are actually enumerated by having someone come and visit their house. But a lot of countries have moved on even from the idea of a kind of 10-year process. So quite a lot of European countries now maintain some kind of register of population, it's just kind of updated on a regular basis. Really, at any point in time, they can compile a snapshot of their population. So I think that's the direction we're moving in, which does mean that this kind of festival of counting that happens every 10 years is probably on its way out. Although I think in many lower income countries that have lower literacy levels and lower internet penetration, we're going to see that traditional census persist for quite a long time. I think today we've been relatively critical about the census and its origins, but the reality is that since maybe the late 19th century, census takers, the kind of statisticians involved in this process, the professionals who make this their life, they really have cared about trying to reach everybody. And there has been a kind of expansion in who was counted. And they really care about the ways in which people were miscounted and undercounted. So I think the censuses that happen today are really better quality than they really have been at any point in history. And so as I kind of said at the beginning, we really have this procedure now which touches more people than practically anything else that's kind of formalized and institutionalized that exists. So I do see a certain sadness in that process eventually being replaced by other things.
And if the census were to disappear, presumably it'd be really missed by all those amateur historians who found the data so useful in tracking their family trees.
I've gone back and looked at my family tree in Australian and British censuses and other documentations from their origins. But of course, if we imagine our descendants, rather, in 100 years' time looking back at us, they won't just have census data to rely on. They'll have probably all of my emails and my tweets and my social media. So in a certain sense, we may lose that kind of formalized system, but we're leaving much, much deeper records of ourselves potentially now than we ever have before.
Thank you, all of you, for exploring the history of census taking with me on the forum. So much more than just numbers. My guests, Tukufu Zuberi, Andrew Whitby and Catherine Levitan. I'm Bridget Kendall. Thanks for listening, and do join us again.